They told me, politely, that I was forgetful. They said it the way one might comment on the weather: inevitable, ordinary, something to accept with a shrug. "Don't worry, she won't remember this," they whispered, as if my entire life could slip unnoticed between the kettle and Harold's old chair. They were wrong. I remembered everything. I live in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where the post office knows your signature and the church pews empty in the same order every Sunday. Harold and I lived in our house for 40 years. We raised roses in the front bed and pots of basil on the back stoop. Harold had a particular way of pouring his tea: 2 fingers steady on the handle, a little clink when the spoon touched the mug. Our home held our history, the way pressed flowers hold scent. The dent on the banister where our daughter once practiced piano, the impression in Harold's slipper from nights he leaned on the table in his sleep. Everything fit together so tightly that when he passed, the silence felt both too vast and too fragile to breathe in. When Harold died, Jillian came back. She said she'd stay just until you settle. She said it with the soft, reassuring tone widows are taught to accept. I gave her the spare room and the key to the side door. She brought casseroles, trimmed the hedges, and sat with me while I sorted Harold's shirts. She hummed hymns on nights when grief pressed its weight onto my ribs. At first, the strange things were small. A bracelet that had lived on my dresser for 2 decades went missing, later found in a kitchen drawer labeled keepsakes. A neighbor, Jan, who used to stop by with lemon bars, began calling less often, saying, "I didn't want to bother you." And Pastor Nolan, who prayed at Harold's bedside during the funeral, started phoning to check in, but Jillian was always the one who answered. Once, she told a visiting niece that I'd been forgetting things lately, using that measured, pity-colored tone people use when they're preparing an audience for a narrative. Then came the labels, not meant to help me, but to define me. Plates, mugs, medicines. The pills my doctor prescribed were no longer in my bathroom. Instead, they were arranged into little packets, dated, initialed, and placed in a drawer in a different room. When I asked why, Jillian smiled the way one smiles at a child who doesn't yet understand bedtime. "Don't worry, Mom, I've got it." Her voice was soft, but her grip on my life tightened with each organized packet. The phone vanished from the kitchen table one afternoon. It was the first time I felt the sharp edge of claustrophobia. No way to call a friend, no easy line to Tom, my neighbor who used to be an estate lawyer. Later that day, Jillian handed me a different phone, a simpler one. "This one is easier," she said, slipping the other into a locked drawer with the quiet finality of a museum curator archiving an artifact. People stopped looking me in the eye. Miriam, who lived 3 doors down and used to bring peach jam, flinched when I mentioned Harold aloud. Carol, my sister, grew tense when the topic of power of attorney came up, as if she were navigating around a hole in the floor. It felt like the whole neighborhood had shifted. Air thinned, pressure lowered, conversations carefully tiptoed. And then the envelope arrived. White, heavy stock, a subtle law office logo in dark ink. Inside was a document I had never signed, a power of attorney placing my life not in my own hands, but in Jillian's. My name sat at the top like a stranger's signature. Jillian's name sat beneath it with confidence. My hand trembled, but I steadied it. Trembling could be used as evidence, I realized. I laid the paper flat. I smoothed its fold. I told myself there must be a mistake. But somewhere deep inside, deeper than grief, deeper than fear, I knew this wasn't sudden. This was the destination of a long path. Small deceptions, bureaucratic strokes, and a narrative sculpted without my consent. Some people unfurl their intentions slowly. Others do it in bold, official gestures. This was both. I thought of confronting her. I imagined shouting, slamming my palm on the counter the way people do on television. But I knew that anger would be turned into proof of confusion. So instead, I became what she expected long enough for her to reveal herself. I watched, and I recorded. It began simply: a quiet voice memo on my phone, a small cough before asking, "Can you tell me who is supposed to pick up the mail?" When she replied, casually, "I'll handle the estate, we'll sell the house and split the proceeds," I asked in a flat tone, "What house?" She repeated the plan, cheerful and matter-of-fact, unaware that every word hummed into the recorder resting against my palm. I started leaving little notebooks in strange corners of the house, writing times and locations like breadcrumbs. Brass key under tea tin, 9-5. I hid a small digital recorder inside my knitting basket, its red light silent, listening as she spoke on the phone. "She won't remember this," she would say, soft and convincing. Each time she used that phrase, it felt like a hand trying to erase me. And each time, I stored the moment away with a clarity she didn't expect. I learned to play the part she imagined. I stared at the labeled cupboards. I hesitated before asking which pills were for my blood. I let my voice tremble in places where she expected weakness. The less she suspected, the more plainly she revealed herself. She believed the narrative she built, believed I was slipping away, believed memory was a thing she could fold and hide like a dish towel. During this time, I began seeing more of Tom Spencer, my neighbor of many years. He brought a thermos of tea and sat across from me at the kitchen table. I played 3 recordings for him. After the third, he exhaled through his nose, the quiet kind of breath men take when they're about to set something right. "The courtroom won't be quiet," he said, "but we can make the truth unmistakable." Together, we built what I called the architecture of proof. We documented dates, preserved recordings, photographed missing items, and prepared sworn statements. Tom insisted on one more piece: an independent neurological and cognitive evaluation. "Not because you need to prove intelligence," he said gently, "but because you need to prove you are yourself." The tests were clinical but kind. A nurse asked me to draw a clock, to name the months backward, to recall 3 simple words. I thought of Harold placing his watch face down on the nightstand each night, and I drew the clock with a hand steadier than my heartbeat. When the results came back, they were crisp: excellent cognitive function, intact memory, full capacity. A quiet relief bloomed in my chest. Meanwhile, Jillian grew bolder. Bullies always do when they sense no resistance. She filmed short videos of me sitting on the sofa, framing the camera to catch stillness instead of strength. She scheduled showings with a realtor, staged empty rooms, left printed transition plans in the hallway. She spoke on the phone to cousins about how efficient everything would be once the house sold. "She won't remember half of it anyway," she added, with a confidence that made my skin cold. One afternoon, she held an open house. Glossy photos of my home hung on display boards: my kitchen, Harold's rose bed, the sun-washed living room. Strangers wandered through with brochures, their voices hushed as if walking through a museum of someone else's memories. I stood by the window with a lukewarm cup of tea in my hands, watching them lift corners of my life like they were checking fabric for stains. And then I walked into the room. "Is this the number you intend to list at?" I asked, loud enough for the visitors to hear. The realtor blinked, startled. "Yes, Margaret, the listing is—" He didn't finish. Something in the room shifted. Jillian stood in the doorway, her well-practiced smile flickering, the phone half raised, as if she had intended to film an entirely different scene. The dutiful daughter, the confused mother. Instead, she faced a room full of witnesses and a woman who remembered everything. Months of her confidence had made her careless. She had spoken freely into the wrong microphone. She had mailed a forged document with a note that read, "as agreed." She had confessed in passing comments recorded by a knitting basket. All of it preserved, dated, undeniable. When Tom filed the motion with the court, the packet was thick, detailed, and irrefutable. We submitted my sworn statement, the cognitive evaluation, notarized transcripts of recordings, photographs of forged signatures, mailed receipts, witness accounts. The courthouse felt heavy that morning, like a place preparing to lift a long-buried truth into daylight. The hearing felt like stepping into a different kind of winter, still, quiet, edged with something sharp. The clerk called the case. The judge arranged her papers with deliberate care. Jillian sat rigid, her confidence frayed under the fluorescent lights. Tom spoke with calm precision. He played the recordings one by one. First, Jillian explaining her plan to sell the house. Second, her admission that she arranged the power of attorney signature without my knowledge. Third, her soft voice saying, "She won't remember this," in a tone meant to disguise control as care. The judge didn't interrupt. She listened with the kind of stillness that makes a room smaller. Tom presented the forged documents next, guiding the court through mismatched ink flows and missing notary marks. The sheriff's representative confirmed that an elder fraud investigation was already underway. When Tom finished, the silence felt dense, almost tangible. Finally, the judge ruled. Jillian's power of attorney was revoked. All estate actions were frozen under court oversight. Any attempt to sell or transfer property was prohibited, and the findings were forwarded to the sheriff's office for further criminal review. There was no applause, no dramatic gasp, just a quiet shift in the air, the weight of truth finally resting where it belonged. And as the courtroom emptied, the consequences began to ripple outward. The realtor's listing was taken down, investigators started digging through financial records, and neighbors whispered gently about what it meant to betray someone who trusted you. It was only the beginning. Months later, the letter arrived, thin, folded, hesitant, as if unsure of its own right to exist. It was from Jillian. She wrote of mistakes and confusion and shame, the words arranged carefully, like someone trying to mend a fabric already torn. Whether her apology could stitch anything back together was not mine to decide. I learned that forgiveness isn't a cheap garment you can buy off a rack. It must be tailored, slowly, deliberately, honestly. In the months following the court's decision, my house became both familiar and foreign. Investigators came and went, papers shuffled, audits were done, inventories followed, signatures checked, dates matched. The house didn't feel fully mine during that time, but the most important things returned. Harold's favorite chair, the mug he used for loose change, the photograph from our wedding day. Each object came back to me like a lost piece of breath. Neighbors began to visit again. Jan stopped by with lemon bars, shyly smiling as if bridging a gap of months. Miriam brought jars of peach jam, setting them on my table with the tenderness of someone repairing a bond. Pastor Nolan visited and prayed without speeches or warnings. He simply sat across from me and listened. It felt as though the town itself had shifted back into orbit. During that time, something unexpected was born. Tom suggested forming a small community fund, something that could help elders who might be quietly slipping into the same kind of danger I had survived. We named it the Roseback Fund, after a private joke Harold and I once shared about growing roses behind an old wooden box. The name felt right, hope hidden in the quiet places. The fund began modestly, a few donations from neighbors, a handful of checks mailed in after church announcements, small gifts from people who whispered, "This could have been someone I love." Some of Jillian's reclaimed assets, those not already spent, went into a restitution arrangement the court approved. I insisted only on one condition, that the fund serve dignity, not spectacle. When the house was finally fully mine again, I walked through each room like walking through chapters of a book I thought had been misplaced. In the seam of my sewing cabinet, I found the little notebook, the one where I had written dates, names, and notes of what had been recorded. The spine was softened from being carried in my pocket. Holding it felt like touching proof of my own persistence. Not long after, I adopted a dog, a brown mutt with an earnest underbite and eyes that looked perpetually surprised. I named him Justice. The choice made my niece laugh, and it made me feel as though the universe had a sense of humor left in it. Justice stole socks, slept on the radiator, and tilted his head whenever I asked if he wanted a walk. He reminded me, in the simplest way, that being needed is a kind of blessing. My days found rhythm again. I baked banana bread on Sundays and handed slices over the fence to neighbors. I tended Harold's rose bed with care, trimming hedges the way he used to, not to prove anything, but because order in small things can steady a heart. I placed his chipped mug back on the shelf, the one with the tiny cracks near the rim. I watered the roses and spoke to them in the evenings, not because they answered, but because speaking aloud helped keep my memories grounded. People sometimes asked if I forgave Jillian. It was a question without a simple answer. I didn't condone what she had done. I didn't pretend the wound was thin. But I could forgive the part of her that once was small and scared, the child who scraped her knee on the porch steps, who slept with a cat curled at the foot of her bed. I could not, however, invite back the version of her who tried to erase me. Forgiveness, I learned, is not the same as restoration. The Roseback Fund grew, slowly but steadily. The community foundation adopted it, adding a few volunteers. We partnered with an elder rights advocacy group to teach seminars at the community center. We created brochures outlining warning signs of financial exploitation. We placed a simple hotline number on each leaflet. A leaflet alone couldn't save a person, but sometimes a leaflet, a neighbor, and a moment of awareness could build a net strong enough to catch someone before they fell. I began telling my story carefully, honestly, because there is a kind of power in naming what tries to stay hidden. Elder exploitation is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, polite, structured. Sometimes it speaks in a gentle voice and wears the clothing of care. And yet, beneath those folds, it can hold sharp edges. I shared my story because someone listening might see a small red flag in their own life or in the life of someone they love. If a story can shift awareness by even an inch, that inch might be the distance between safety and suffering. There were afternoons when I drove with Justice in the passenger seat and thought of Harold's hands on the steering wheel, guiding us home by the familiar landmarks of sycamores and fence posts. There were nights when I still reached for the weight of his body beside me, forgetting for a moment that the bed had been empty of him for years. Memory is strange like that. It softens and sharpens at the same time. I kept certain routines because they grounded me. I tended roses, folded laundry, wrote letters to my niece with recipes tucked inside. I kept the little notebook of dates and witnesses because it reminded me of something vital. I had not disappeared. I had not been erased. I had reclaimed my life in the precise moments someone thought I wouldn't remember it. Sometimes I sat with the notebook open on my lap and whispered the words she once used against me. She won't remember this. I whispered it not in fear, but in defiance, because I did remember. I remembered enough to protect myself, enough to seek justice, enough to rebuild. People often asked me what I would have done differently. I told them that I would have listened sooner to that small, uneasy voice in my chest. I would have asked for witnesses earlier. I would have asked Harold, while he was still here, to leave clearer instructions about documents and roles. But most of all, I told them this: shame is the accomplice of theft. It convinces people to apologize for being wronged. It keeps them silent in the very moments they should speak. And once shame is named, its power weakens. Life in town became gentler with time. Some days felt quieter, some carried an echo, but silence is not the same as emptiness. I began to return to small pleasures that had once felt out of reach. I went to the farmer's market on Saturdays and brought home pears, offering one to any neighbor who walked with me. I took Justice to the park, where he made friends with every dog in sight, tugging the leash with the enthusiasm of something newly born. I baked banana bread and gave a slice to Pastor Nolan when he visited. He always said the same thing: "You keep me humble, Margaret," and the simplicity of that phrase stitched the past to the present like a clean seam. In the afternoons, I sat on the back stoop with the roses whispering in the wind, sipping tea from Harold's chipped mug. I spoke to the roses as though they were old friends. "Hold fast," I would tell them. "Don't let the world prune you too soon." They didn't answer, of course, but caring for them kept my breathing steady and my memory anchored. I continued sharing my story when asked, not because I sought praise or pity, but because stories can be a kind of compass. They help others find direction when they're unsure how to navigate their own shadows. My story is not one of triumph or spectacle. It is a map of sorts. This is how to look. This is how to listen. This is how to stand when someone tries to unmake you. Sometimes, when I read aloud from the old notebook, I pause at the dates where everything wavered. I remember how fragile I felt then and how strong I learned to be. I remember that the smallest acts of care, Jan's lemon bars, Miriam's jam, Tom's quiet determination, were the scaffolding that held justice steady. Courts and evaluations played their part, yes, but it was the community, the neighbors, the pastor, the ordinary people around me who made the truth undeniable. If you are listening to this and feel the slightest ache of recognition, if you worry someone you love is being isolated, misled, or overshadowed, please trust that feeling. You do not need proof to begin asking questions. You do not need permission to check in. Sometimes an hour of attention, a phone call, or a conversation can prevent a slow unraveling of someone's entire life. And if you need help, there are advocates, resources, and people ready to stand beside you. People sometimes feared the word memory, as though it were delicate, slipping away like steam. But memory is more than recall. Memory is identity. Memory is choice. Memory is the quiet insistence of the self saying, "I am still here." And I am. I think often of Harold, of the sound his spoon made against his mug, of the warmth of his hand on my shoulder, of the way he looked at me on our 17th wedding anniversary and said, "You found me." I find him now in little places, in the kitchen light, in the roses, in the steady beat of my own persistence. Love, I've learned, does not leave. It lingers in the spaces where we continue to care. As for the phrase she used, "She won't remember this," I sometimes say it aloud now, but the meaning has changed entirely. It is no longer an erasure. It is a reclamation. I speak it with a quiet strength. She won't remember this the way they intended. She will remember what matters. Because I do. I remember enough. Enough to keep myself whole, enough to rebuild, enough to help someone else see the warning signs before the ground shifts under them. If you ever walk past my home in June, you'll see the roses blooming along the fence. A small sign, sun-faded and humble, reads Roseback Fund. Justice will likely bark at you from the front window, tail wagging like a metronome. If you knock, I will open the door. I'll pour you tea in Harold's chipped mug, and we'll sit on the back stoop together. We'll talk about the weather and about roses and about the little things that keep life steady. And if you want to hear the story again, I'll tell it. Because stories, like roses, grow stronger when tended, and because remembering isn't just something I can do, it's something I choose to do. My name is Margaret Hill, and I remember everything.